Thank you. So, as you heard, my book tells the story of blogging. Where did this thing come from? Who are the people who created it? And what are their stories? So, yeah, thanks. Is this better? Sorry, I'll start over. No. So, who are the people who started blogging? And what were their stories? It's a kind of a contemporary history. And the common reaction I get from a lot of people when they hear that is, history? Blogging? How can that be? It's so new. But in fact, blogs are 10 years old by that name, and websites that were like blogs were around a lot longer than that. So there's plenty of history, a lot of stories, tales of what happens when people get the chance to say everything they want to in public. I think these stories have a lot to teach us as we move more and more of our lives online. The culture of Silicon Valley, the tech industry, and the web tends to have a very short memory. And even though the story of how blogging began is a recent one, it's not that well known. I'd watched a lot of it firsthand myself, and I thought it would be good to get it down while it's still fresh. So a decade ago, I was the technology editor at Salon.com. And my job was to find one story a day to edit. We'd edit it, we'd illustrate it, we'd publish it with a certain amount of loving care. Now, there were a bunch of websites that I found myself returning to over and over during the course of my day, because every time I returned to them, they had something new. These sites didn't put a lot of time and effort into each story. In fact, they didn't really even publish stories. They posted items. Some of these sites were produced by professionals, others were amateurs or one-man shows. They all shared a couple of traits. They linked a lot. They weren't afraid, the way so many news sites are, of sending you away, because they figured you'd be back. Even more important, they didn't have a lead story or a top story. Each time they posted something new, it just went at the top of the page. Now, I was an editor. I spent lots of time in meetings that were held expressly to decide what goes at the top of the page. And here, these sites were saying, you don't need to do that. So this was a little distressing, a little hurtful even to me. Yet I kept going back to these sites. They worked. And in 1998, people began calling these sites weblogs. A year later, it got shortened to blogs. Today, there are millions of them around the globe. Close to 1 million new posts every day. What the early bloggers discovered was a way of organizing writing that was native to the web. It made such sense that it took off. It wasn't an import from print or broadcasting. And it wasn't discovered by people like me who had arrived on the web with their heads full of notions from print and broadcasting. It was discovered by outsiders who fell in love with the web and what it could do. In Say Everything, I tell some of their stories. In the first part of the book, I tell the tales of some of blogging's founders, people who established many of the norms of the blogging world, but whose own stories actually each have a bit of a tragic dimension. None of them gets exactly what they're seeking from their blogs. In the second part of the book, I tell how blogging scaled up from a few dozen people to millions. And in the final section, I look at what the rise of blogging has meant and continues to mean for our culture, for journalism, and the future. So, if I can ask for a show of hands, how many of you here read blogs? Okay. And how many of you have ever written a blog? Great, thank you. Now, when I asked this question, you probably had to ask yourself another question, right? What is a blog? Because there isn't that much agreement on that question. The usual definition is it's a personal website where the new stuff goes on top with a lot of links to other sites. That definition is pretty useful. It's pretty neutral. It describes a form. But for many of us, the word blogging has also come to describe a movement. And the movement is all about getting people to speak for themselves, people deciding for themselves what to write and what to read. Today there are political bloggers, personal bloggers, econo-bloggers, and mommy bloggers. Bloggers who are trying to build businesses and bloggers who are trying to make art. bloggers of every stripe. It's impossible to tell all their stories. In writing Say Everything, I had to choose just a few. I looked for the stories of people who had understood what was happening way before I did. I looked for stories that hadn't already been told. And I looked for stories that might have something to teach us. I begin with a guy named Justin Hall. He was a 19-year-old college student who started his website in January 1994. And at that point, the web was actually mostly filled with academic research. Hall looked at it and thought, hey, I can build a site and it can be all about me. He also started linking to other sites he found that he liked that were cool or weird. So right there you have the two foundations of blogging, autobiography and links. Hall was sort of the original oversharer. He knew no boundaries. He really did say everything, including detailed accounts of his love life and sometimes nude pictures of himself. A decade later, he fell in love with a woman who told him basically, forget it. It's me or the blog. Well, Hall made the sensible choice. Let me read a brief passage from the book about the impact that Hall had. There's an endearing habit Justin Hall has, as Howard Rheingold describes it, of shoving you aside, sitting down at your computer, and reconfiguring everything for your own good. Changing the default settings of your web browser or your word processing program, arranging your desktop using helpful features you didn't know about. In a sense, Hall changed the defaults of the web itself. In its formative stages, he turned it into an arena for youthful self-exposure. He put on a defiantly outrageous show, attracted a following, and demonstrated how easy it was to do both. He took a medium that had been conceived as a repository for scholarship and scaled it down to personal size. Then he took his confessions and intimacies and blasted them out to the whole world. The web was what made all this possible, but Justin Hall made it the norm, the expected, the default. So another pioneer who shaped blogging as we know it today was Dave Winer. Winer was a software developer who started an email newsletter in 1994 because he felt that the tech industry press did a lousy job covering his field. Winer saw that the rise of the internet meant that the participants in the industry didn't have to depend on these trade publications to tell their own stories. They could do it themselves. They were the people formerly known as sources. Winer went on to create one of the earliest and most influential weblogs called Scripting News. He foresaw a future in which millions of people would have their own websites. He was sometimes mocked for this by dismissive journalists, but he was right. He also harbored a hope that those millions of sites would help make the internet a more civil space. He saw a blog as the unedited voice of a person. Your blog was a space where no one could tell you to shut up. And once we gave everyone such a space, maybe people would fight less and communicate better. Alas, we're still waiting for that to happen. So blogging started with people like Justin Hall and Dave Winer, outsiders with a passion for this new form and new space. And once they and the other pioneers I write about got it started, it began to spread rapidly. In Say Everything, I tried to sort of follow a spark. It started among software developers, as so much on the web does, and then spread to upstart journalists, political writers, and concerned citizens, then out into the business world and popular culture and beyond. I tell the story of Evan Williams and Meg Hourahan, the founders of the company that created Blogger 10 years ago. Blogger was the software that really first brought blogging out of the tech ghetto and onto a wider stage, beginning in 1999. It was a sort of a side project, a tool that Williams and Hourahan used to communicate with each other. They'd post little notes and ideas and links to other stuff on the web. And then they thought, hey, if we make this public, it might be fun and help our business. That turned out to be right. Then they thought, maybe we should create a tool that makes it easy for anyone to do the same thing. That was a very good idea. From that point forward, the people and stories in Say Everything spread out much more widely. I write about a young reporter named Josh Marshall who started blogging during the Florida recount in 2000.